Hello and welcome to U.S. News and World Report. Here with me is Mark DeWeaver, an economist and author of the new book, Animal Spirits with Chinese Characteristics, Investment Booms and Busts in the World's Emerging Economic Giant. Welcome, Mark.
Oh, thank you, Simon.
And you talk. One of my favorite data points in the book is about Chinese wind farms and how there's actually a lot of them that they build, and we always hear these data points about how China makes more wind farms than anyone else in the world, but in fact they're not really using a lot of them, and that kind of speaks to the inefficiencies of how investments are made in China. Why isn't China using many of the wind farms that it's creating?
That's an interesting story. It seems that they made a decision that by 2020, 8% of the main electric power companies' capacity was supposed to come from non-hydro alternative energy sources, and the power companies decided that they would go for building wind farms because that's more that's a more viable technology than solar or other technologies. So what they did, though, is because the target was for capacity rather than for something like annual sales, they simply built wind farms in the windiest locations, regardless of whether there was going to be any connection to the electricity grid. So the result is that I believe that the recent number is something like 25%, I think, of Chinese wind power turbines are not connected to the grid, and it may take many years to connect all of this capacity to the grid. And you could say, well, look how far-sighted they're being, but actually it doesn't make sense to build these things years in advance, because a lot of the windiest locations are also locations where there's a lot of wind-blown sand. So a lot of these things are being continuously blasted by sand, for example, from the Gobi Desert. So it's you know, the life of these turbines is really not that long. If there's going to be a prolonged period of years before a turbine is connected to the grid, you've significantly reduced the working life of the turbine.
Mm-hmm. But we've also seen this with airports, right? What would give a locality to build incentive to build an airport that they were going to barely ever use? And we see this more and more with cities in China.
Right. There's been quite a boom in airport construction, and it's continuing even now. I think there's something like 45 new airports being planned. And the thing about the airports is that they tend to, like many infrastructure projects, they tend to be done or the localities decide to do them not on the basis of any real cost-benefit analysis, but rather because during the construction phase you can get a boost to local GDP growth, and local officials' promotion prospects depend more on GDP growth in their jurisdictions than on any other factor. So what local officials will do is they'll start a project like an airport, or there are a lot of other examples. Theme parks is another great example. And there'll be a boost to GDP growth as the airport is constructed, and also having an airport there may help them to draw in investment from outside of their jurisdiction, which can provide an additional burst to boost to GDP growth. Once the airport is open, it's unlikely in a lot of cases that there'll really be enough flights to justify the expense of building it, but this isn't really an important consideration. What the local official is concerned about primarily is he needs to outrank other officials in his peer group in terms of GDP growth. And so building the airport is a great way to do that, because it contributes to investment, which is a part of GDP. Later on, when it turns out that the airport is a white elephant, if he's been successful, he'll have been moved on to some other position anyway, and the problem that the airport was a waste of money no longer really concerns him.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the idea of these localities and people, politicians competing with each other basically across localities. Obviously, in the U.S., we experience this with states competing with each other, trying to give tax incentives to get
Right.
businesses to move to them. How does this compare? That system that we're used to in the United States. How does that compare to how Chinese localities compete with each other?
Actually, it's really exactly the same story we have in the United States. What's different is the magnitude of the problem. In the United States, we don't have localities controlling almost all of the land. We don't have localities that are free to, for example, allow investors to set up steel projects without any air pollution control devices installed. We don't have localities that control all, like the lion's share of the firms within their jurisdiction. We don't have localities that are not really subject to effective oversight either from the federal government or from their constituents. Chinese localities, on the other hand, have enormous economic power and are subject to only sporadic supervision from Beijing and are not really accountable to their constituents at all. So really, I mean, it is the same phenomenon that we see in the U.S. For example, so many cities in the U.S. have built sports stadiums that don't make any economic sense. And there are a lot of similar stories in China where you find, for example, localities building things like Olympic-sized swimming pools or replicas of different parts of the Beijing 2008 Olympics. Or one locality built a what was this? It was a copy of the one of the pavilions at the Shanghai Expo in the middle of a impoverished farming community. They built this thing. The only difference, again, from the U.S. localities, it's just the difference has to do with the magnitude of the problem. U.S. local governments aren't controlling most of the U.S. economy, so the same thing happens, but it doesn't matter as much.
Well, one thing that there was a lot of talk of, especially as Mitt Romney was running last year, was this idea of creative destruction. The idea that we have to allow companies to go bankrupt, and that makes our economy more efficient and allows better companies to spring up. Does creative destruction really exist in China if companies on the verge of collapse are continually propped up by government investment?
It exists to a much lesser degree. I think in this particular case, I think Mitt Romney's right that creative destruction is a real strength of the U.S. economy. That and you don't really appreciate that. You can't appreciate that really properly until you have looked at the case of China, where creative destruction is a much less potent force, and you can see that the result is that they have enormous excess capacity in areas like steel and non-ferrous metals and what are some other examples? Paper, I think, glass. There are quite a few examples, and what happens is that local governments tend to build these plants to produce these kinds of products on very small scale, so that what they have is an enormous excess capacity of production that's of an inefficiently small scale. So you have, for example, very small cement plants or steel smelters, and they stay in business because they don't have any real hard budget constraint. There isn't really any mechanism to put them out of business. If they have loans from the state-owned bank, the loans will be rolled over. It's quite rare for these local government supported enterprises to go into bankruptcy. In a worst case, they won't go into bankruptcy. That some other company will be forced to acquire them or merge with them. So creative destruction works much less well in an economy that's dominated by the state, because powerful people that are politically powerful will be able to block in efforts to shut down production, so that you don't really have this force of we don't really have market forces culling the weaker players from particular industries.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my last question would be, how much longer can China sustain these kinds of really inefficient investment cycles, booms and busts? Is its booming economy always going to kind of carry it, or are we looking at a day where a lot of these bubbles burst simultaneously and it sends the entire world economy into a downfall?
I think that as long as China continues to have a economy that's dominated by the state and specifically by local governments, they will continue to have the same boom-bust cycle that they've always had. I think, though, that the real problem is that China's high rates of economic growth are really not sustainable, that the share of investment in GDP now has reached 50%, and it's really not conceivable that that's going to continue to grow to 100%.
And what happens when that slows down?
Right. I think when that slows down, what will happen is that Chinese GDP growth will be much slower than it has been up until now. I don't think, though, that we should expect anything like a financial crisis in China, because financial crises aren't really going to happen in an economic system where the state owns all of the banks. There isn't really ever going to be banking crises in the state-owned banking sector. Instead, what you will end up having is protracted periods of subpar growth.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, those were all the questions I had. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks, Simon.
All right.